On October 2nd, 2015, the body of a 20-year-old Indiana University student was found in Griffy Lake, just north of Bloomington, Indiana. His name was Joseph Smedley. Within days, law enforcement ruled his death a suicide. The case was closed. Tonight, we are not here to argue that ruling. We are here to examine how that ruling was built, how it was explained, how it was presented to the public, and how the designation closed shaped what information followed. This is not a storytelling episode. This is a listening episode. We want listeners to know some records have been provided and other investigatory records have been withheld. Episode 3A reflects what is publicly visible right now. Welcome back to the Casewalker Chronicles. If you've listened to our first 2 episodes, you already know this podcast does not retell stories the way most true crime shows do. We don't summarize tragedies, we don't narrate emotion, and we don't accept official conclusions simply because they're repeated. What we do instead is examine how cases are constructed, how narratives are reinforced, and how institutions present outcomes to the public.
And that matters, because the way a case is explained often shapes understanding more than the facts themselves, especially when a case is labeled closed.
We keep saying this episode is different. And yes, technically, they've all been different. But this one is different in structure. Joseph Smedley's case is officially closed. We want to be very clear about that. This episode does not exist to overturn a ruling, assign blame, or declare an alternate outcome. Instead, this episode exists for one specific purpose: to re-examine how a closed case is presented, and to help listeners recognize when summary replaces transparency.
This is also the first 2-part episode of our season. That's intentional. Records related to this case have been formally requested. We have received limited call level and incident summary documentation, while additional investigatory records were withheld under Indiana public records law. So rather than speculate, we're doing what most coverage does not do. We are stopping.
This episode, episode 3A, examines the official version of this case as it has been publicly presented. Episode 3B, if and when records are released, will examine what changes when documentation replaces summary. That distinction matters. This podcast follows what we call the Casewalker Evidence Book Method. That means we separate 3 things, clearly and intentionally: what is documented, what is stated, and what is assumed. If information comes from official records, we identify it. If information comes from secondary reporting, media coverage, podcasts, or public commentary, we say so. And when the documentation is missing, we do not fill those gaps with theory.
Because once gaps are filled without records, examination shifts into storytelling. That is not what we're here to do.
Joseph Smedley's case is not being examined in isolation. It is part of a broader pattern that appears across this season. Cases that were closed quickly. Cases that relied on summary rather than publicly accessible documentation. Cases where institutions asked the public to accept conclusions without providing the underlying material. This season is about learning how to listen for that pattern, not emotionally, but structurally.
Joseph Smedley was 20 years old. He was a sophomore at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. In the fall of 2015, he lived in off-campus housing near Mitchell Street with roommates. Those facts are documented.
What is not publicly documented is also important. There is no released psychological profile, no medical history summary, no academic distress report, no written narrative establishing mental state. Because those records are not available, we will not speculate about them here. What you are about to hear is the officially summarized time frame of Joseph Smedley's disappearance and death. As you listen, pay attention not to just what is said, but to how it is presented. Summaries can feel complete, but summaries are not the same as timelines built from records.
Timelines built from records show how events are known. In this case, the underlying records that would support a full reconstruction have not been released. What follows is the narrative timeline, not a documented reconstruction.
Before we continue, we pause for our missing person spotlight. Every episode of the Casewalker Chronicles includes this segment because visibility matters and because missing persons deserve attention while there is still time to help. This week, the spotlight shines on Haley Busby.
Haley Busby is 17 years old and missing from Fishers, Indiana. According to official reports, she was last seen at approximately 10 p.m. on January 5th, 2026, in the Enclave at Vermilion neighborhood in Fishers, Indiana.
Haley was last seen wearing a white blouse, gray jeans, and a black puffer jacket.
If you have any information that could help locate Haley Busby, please contact the Fishers Police Department at 317-773-1282 or call 911.
A missing person remains missing until they are found, no matter how much time passes. If you see something, say something. This section of the episode focuses on what we're calling the narrative timeline, not a reconstruction built from released records, but the sequence of events as they have been summarized publicly. As you listen, notice where specificity exists and where approximation takes its place.
According to publicly available records and secondary reporting, Joseph Smedley was last reportedly seen by his roommates late on Sunday, September 27, 2015. That evening, Joseph reportedly left his residence sometime late that night. Exact departure times varied depending on the source, and no official timestamp movement log has been released to the public.
When a timeline begins with language like, sometime late that evening, it tells you something important. It tells you that precise timing is not documented in the public record. That does not mean the event didn't happen. It means those records have not been publicly released to establish when it happened.
Secondary reporting, including media summaries and podcast coverage, references Joseph being downtown earlier that evening. In some accounts, specific establishments are mentioned. However, law enforcement has not publicly released surveillance summaries, entry or exit timestamps, or corroborated movement records related to those locations.
In many summaries, phrases like, Joseph was downtown, appear without attribution. What is not made clear is who confirmed that information, how it was confirmed, or whether it was based on records or recollection. Again, that distinction matters, because confirmation based on documentation and confirmation based on memory are not the same thing. This is one of the ways narrative timelines take shape. Statements are presented in complete sentences. They sound resolved. But the supporting material, the how, the when, and the why, it's not visible.
That doesn't mean the summary is inaccurate. It means the foundation is not available for public review. Public summaries indicate that Joseph did not return home that night. At some point, concern was raised when he did not reappear. What is not publicly documented is the exact time concern began, who first noticed his absence, or what steps were taken immediately. There is no released incident log in the materials provided to date showing a same-night welfare check.
When timelines move from last seen directly to reported missing, the period in between becomes undefined. The public is told that time passed, but not how it was experienced or what actions occurred during it. Here's why this matters, not just for this case, but for anyone listening. Missing person laws are not abstract. They exist to guide real decisions made in real time with incomplete information.
Indiana law creates a framework. It allows reports to be made immediately. It allows adults to be classified as endangered when circumstances justify it. and it gives law enforcement discretion to determine response based on what is known at the time a report is received.
For the listener, this means something important. If someone in your life goes missing, there is no legal requirement to wait. There is no threshold of time that must pass before concern is valid, and the way a case is classified early can shape everything that follows.
Classification influences urgency. Urgency influences action, and action or inaction becomes part of the record.
Now, bring that back to Joseph Smedley. Joseph was a 20-year-old college student, an adult under the law, not a juvenile, not automatically classified as endangered based on age alone. What would have mattered procedurally were the circumstances known at the time: his sudden absence, his failure to return home, and any indicators of vulnerability that may or may not have been identified when concern was first raised.
What we do not have access to are the records that would show how those factors are evaluated, or whether an endangered classification was considered at all.
This is not about what should have happened. It is about what we can see. Without documentation, we cannot tell how Indiana's statutory framework was applied in practice, only that a period of time passed before Joseph was officially reported missing.
And once time passes without documentation, the public record begins with absence, not action.
This is why procedural clarity matters, not because the law guarantees outcomes. It does not. But because the law shapes decisions, and decisions shape timelines. When those timelines are later summarized, the process disappears, and only dates remain.
That's the distinction we're asking you to hear. Dates tell you when something happened. Process tells you how it was handled.
In this case, the law existed. The framework existed. What we do not have is visibility into how it was applied. That absence doesn't prove failure, but it does limit understanding. And understanding, not belief, is the purpose of this episode.
Because Joseph was an Indiana University student, early involvement included Indiana University Police Department. That is consistent with jurisdiction over student welfare concerns. However, the public record does not include a full IUPD incident report, an investigative action log, or written coordination notes with other agencies.
In narrative timelines, this phrase is often compressed. Instead of being walked through early decisions, the public is given a summary phrase, something like, authorities began searching. Searching, however, is not a single action. It is a series of decisions. Without records, those decisions are not visible. Narrative timelines often feel complete because they move forward. Last seen, reported missing, found. But forward motion does not equal clarity.
When a case is later described as closed, that progression can give the impression that there is nothing left to examine, even when supporting documentation is not publicly available.
At this point in the timeline, there are no publicly released records available to us showing a documented reconstruction of Joseph's final movements, verified timestamps supported by data, or a written explanation of investigative conclusions during the missing person phase. That does not automatically indicate error or misconduct. It does indicate limited visibility.
And limited visibility matters most in cases that will later be formally closed.
5 days after Joseph was last reportedly seen, his body was discovered. That moment changes the nature of the case, not emotionally, procedurally.
Because once a body is found, the case is no longer about a missing person. It becomes a death investigation, and responsibility shifts.
Up to this point, Joseph Smedley's case existed in a space of uncertainty. A missing person, an unresolved absence, an open question. On Friday, October 2nd, 2015, that changes. The incident documentation we received reflects that Bloomington police logged the call the evening of October 2nd.
On that day, Joseph Smedley's body was discovered in Griffy Lake, just north of Bloomington, Indiana. He was 20 years old. From that moment forward, this was no longer a missing person investigation. It became a death investigation.
This is an important procedural shift, and one the public is rarely asked to consider. When a body is located, investigations do not simply continue. They reframe. The questions change, the authority changes, and the process begins moving towards classification.
In Joseph Smedley's case, jurisdiction shifted from Indiana University Police Department to the Bloomington Police Department. That transfer is standard, but standard does not mean simple. Once jurisdiction transfers, a single agency becomes responsible for the investigation. That agency becomes the keeper of the evidence, the coordinator of next steps, and the primary source of public information.
This is where listening carefully matters, because once a single agency holds the case, public understanding begins to rely almost entirely on how that agency summarizes its findings. Conclusions are shared. Process is rarely shown.
There are public statements indicating that Joseph Smedley's body was found floating in a shallow area of Griffy Lake. Authorities stated that there were no immediate signs of foul play. There were no public statements indicating a struggle or third-party involvement at the scene.
Phrases like, "no immediate signs of foul play," communicate an outcome. They do not explain how that outcome was reached. They tell the public what was concluded, not how the conclusion was formed.
That distinction matters, especially at scene level, where conclusions are informed by observations, measurements, and documentation the public does not see.
At this stage of a death investigation, substantial documentation typically exists. In this case, the following materials are not publicly visible at this time: scene diagrams, evidence photographs, water depth measurements, recovery reports, dive team notes, or chain of custody documentation.
Without those materials, independent evaluation of the scene is not possible. That does not indicate wrongdoing. It does indicate reliance on summary rather than publicly accessible documentation.
This is an important distinction to hold on to. A scene summary tells you what investigators concluded. A scene record shows you how they arrived there. In Joseph Smedley's case, the summary is available. The underlying record is not.
And once an initial assessment is made at the scene, everything that follows tends to build from that starting point. Evidence is interpreted within that frame. Questions are narrowed. Alternate explanations are considered within defined limits.
That's not an accusation. It's a description of how investigative processes work once a working assessment has been established.
Following the recovery, the investigation moved forward quickly. An autopsy was ordered, toxicology testing was conducted. Within days, a manner of death was determined.
Speed is not inherently problematic, but when speed is paired with limited transparency, the public is left with conclusions without access to the material that supports them.
The next phase of the investigation is the autopsy. This is where medical findings begin to inform legal classification.
And this is where summaries often replace substance, because while conclusions are shared, the documentation behind them is rarely released. That's where we're headed next. When a death investigation reaches the autopsy stage, the nature of the inquiry changes. This is where medical findings, which describe what happened to a body, begin to inform legal conclusions, which determine how a death is classified. That transition matters.
Following the recovery of Joseph Smedley's body, an autopsy was conducted. The official cause of death was listed as drowning. That finding is not publicly disputed.
This is a distinction most people are never taught to listen for. Cause of death answers the question: what physically happened? Manner of death answers a different question: how the death is classified.
There are generally 5 manners of death used in death investigations: natural, accidental, suicide, homicide, and undetermined. Selecting one of those categories is not purely medical, it involves interpretation. Public summaries indicate that toxicology testing found alcohol and THC in Joseph Smedley's system.
Toxicology establishes presence. It shows what substances were present in the body. It does not, on its own, establish intent, sequence of events, or state of mind.
How toxicology is presented often provides context for later conclusions, even when that context is not explicitly explained.
When toxicology findings are introduced alongside a cause of death, they often function as explanatory background. Alcohol and THC can suggest impairment. Impairment can suggest vulnerability. Those associations exist culturally, even when they are not stated directly.
This pattern appears in many death investigations. It is not unique to this case. In Joseph Smedley's case, the manner of death was ruled a suicide. With that determination, the investigation reached its formal conclusion and the case was closed.
Once a manner of death is assigned, the investigation transitions from inquiry to record. There is no criminal suspect, no adversarial process, no courtroom review. The determination becomes the final account.
That does not mean the determination was incorrect. It means the conclusion stands without judicial testing.
Despite the weight of a manner of death ruling, the following materials have not been publicly released: the full autopsy report, the medical examiner's narrative findings, documentation explaining how alternative manners of death were considered, or a written rationale supporting the final conclusion.
Without those records, the public cannot independently evaluate how the ruling was reached. They can only know the outcome.
In closed cases, a suicide classification signals that there is no suspect, no ongoing threat, and no further investigative action anticipated. That signal shapes how the case is understood going forward.
While that may accurately reflect investigative conclusions, the absence of documentation means those conclusions rely on institutional trust rather than public review. Members of Joseph Smedley's family have publicly stated that they do not believe his death was a suicide. That position has been reported in media coverage and interviews.
Family disagreement does not invalidate an official determination. It does, however, underscore the importance of transparency when conclusions are questioned. In this case, the documentation that would allow independent review has not been publicly released. At this point, Joseph Smedley's case is officially resolved on paper. The classification is final. The file is closed.
What remains is not a dispute over outcome, but an examination of process.
And that distinction is where this episode turns next. At this point in the process, Joseph Smedley's case was officially closed. That word, closed, carries weight, but it is also a word that often goes unexplained. A case can be closed without ever being tested. Those two things are not the same.
When a case goes to court, evidence is challenged. Witnesses are questioned, timelines are scrutinized, assumptions are examined. Joseph Smedley's case did not enter a courtroom.
Joseph's case was resolved administratively through investigative determination. There was no trial, no defense, no prosecution, no adversarial process.
That does not mean the conclusion was wrong. It means the conclusion was never subjected to judicial testing.
When people hear that a case is closed, they often assume that evidence was examined publicly, conclusions were challenged, and competing explanations were weighed. In an administrative closure, none of that occurs.
Instead, the public receives the outcome without access to the process that produced it. Cases classified as suicide almost never proceed to court. There is no defendant, no criminal charge, no legal mechanism requiring adversarial review.
As a result, the determination becomes final without being externally tested, even when questions remain. Courts do not exist to tell stories. They exist to test claims. Evidence must withstand cross-examination. Timelines must hold under scrutiny. Assumptions must be defended.
In Joseph Smedley's case, that testing did not occur, not because it was prevented, but because the case structure never required it.
This is where Joseph Smedley's case extends beyond Joseph Smedley, because this same structure appears repeatedly. Cases resolved administratively, narratives accepted publicly, and no formal mechanism to revisit conclusions once files are closed.
Over time, this creates patterns. Not necessarily patterns of wrongdoing, but patterns of unexamined authority.
Each case, viewed in isolation, can appear reasonable, but when examined collectively, similarities emerge. Rapid classifications, limited documentation release, heavy reliance on summary language, and little incentive to reopen conclusions.
This is not a conspiracy. It is a system functioning within its own structural limits.
This is why Episode 3A stops at this point. Not because there is nothing more to say, but because continuing without records would turn examination into speculation.
Documentation related to this case has been formally requested. We will wait for those records. And if they are released, we will return to this case with a different kind of conversation.
At this point, it's reasonable to ask why we're stopping here. Why not dig deeper? Why not analyze motives? Why not compare theories? Those questions come up in almost every closed case. The answer is simple. Because none of that means anything without records. Opinions don't change cases. Interpretations don't create accountability. Documentation does.
Records show who said what, when decisions were made, and how conclusions were justified, and where uncertainty existed at the time. They slow narratives down.
Records replace summary with sequence. They turn statements like, "It was determined," into explanations of how it was determined. They allow conclusions to be examined rather than assumed.
Without records, the public is left with outcomes, but not foundations. Formal public records requests have been submitted in connection with this case. Those requests seek documentation that typically exists with a death investigation, including incident and investigative reports, interagency communication, evidence inventories, and related materials.
As of this recording, we have received a limited set of records, and we have also received confirmation that other investigatory records were not released. Waiting is often misunderstood as inaction. In investigative work, waiting is discipline. It is a decision not to replace missing documentation with narrative.
Systems often rely on attention fading. They rely on the public moving on before records are ever reviewed. Choosing to wait, publicly and intentionally, interrupts that cycle. Records do not guarantee a different conclusion. They do not promise reversal, vindication, or resolution.
What they promise is visibility. They allow conclusions to be evaluated rather than accepted. That distinction matters. Joseph Smedley's case was closed, but closure without transparency limits understanding, not because of conspiracy, but because of structure. This case deserves to be examined with the same care that was used to conclude it.
And that examination begins with records, not reactions.
This episode is not asking you to reject the official conclusion. It is not asking you to substitute one belief for another. It is asking you to understand how conclusions are reached and how often they are accepted without access to the underlying documentation.
That skill, learning how to listen critically, is foundational to accountability.
Before we close Part A, there is one final thing we want to say clearly. This pause is intentional, and it is the point. If you take one thing from this episode, let it be this. A closed case is not the same thing as a transparent one.
And an official conclusion is not the same thing as an examined one.
As you encounter other cases in the news, in court summaries, in documentaries, and in podcasts, listen for the structure. Listen for where summaries replace specifics, where conclusions arrive without explanation, and where documentation is referenced but never shown.
Pay attention to how quickly you are told there is nothing left to examine. That timing matters.
Season 1 of the Casewalker Chronicles is not about revisiting cases for shock value or resolution. It is about examining systems, investigative systems, judicial systems, narrative systems. Joseph Smedley's case is one chapter in that examination.
Not because it is exceptional, but because it is familiar. If and when records related to this case are released, we will return. Episode 3B will not retell this story.
It will test it, line by line, document by document, without assumption. Joseph Smedley was 20 years old. His case was closed. Tonight, we examined how that closure was presented.
What comes next depends on transparency.
If you or someone you know is struggling, help is available. In the United States, you can call or text 988, the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. This has been the Casewalker Chronicles.
And we hope you keep walking with us.